The device in my pocket rang persistently, interrupting my concentration. I dried the perspiration from my forehead and walked outside the temporary medical facility where the afternoon sun created extended shadows across the countryside village. The caller ID displayed a name that made my heart sink. Richard. I nearly let it ring through to voicemail, having dealt with my stepfather's schemes for years and knowing his calls seldom delivered welcome news. However, curiosity and perhaps a slim thread of optimism convinced me otherwise. "Hello," I responded, maintaining an even tone. "Catherine." His voice was upbeat, far too upbeat. "I thought you'd like to know I've put the mountain cabin up for sale." I stopped moving, my grip on the phone intensifying. "You did what?" "Sold it," he echoed as if it were completely normal. "Don't act so surprised. It's for everyone's benefit. Well, mine specifically." He released an arrogant chuckle that infuriated me. "I'm Catherine, and Richard has been my constant source of frustration for as far back as I can recall. My mother wed him during my 15th year, and he rapidly integrated himself into our family using charm and wit. Yet underneath that facade lived a person who consistently prioritized his own needs above all else. The cabin represented more than just a holiday retreat. It served as my refuge, a location where I'd invested years of affection and attention. Tucked away in the mountains, it was my destination for renewal after exhausting work travels, my venue for hosting friends during extended weekends, and where I experienced the deepest tranquility. Listening to Richard discuss it as though it were merely a piece in his continuous manipulations was maddening. "You lacked the authority," I stated, my voice trembling. "That cabin wasn't yours to put on the market." "Take it easy," he said dismissively. "I've been handling affairs here while you're away playing world savior. Besides, what's the sense in clinging to something you rarely use? It provided a simple solution to eliminate my debts. You'll express gratitude eventually." "I'll express gratitude when pigs fly," I retorted, ending the call before he could continue speaking. I walked back and forth, attempting to settle the tempest of feelings churning within me. Richard's boldness had no limits, but this instance crossed every boundary. What he remained unaware of, and what I planned to keep secret temporarily, was that the cabin didn't belong entirely to me. My closest friend Laura held co-ownership, and our legal contract from years prior explicitly demanded both our signatures for any transaction to proceed. This matter was far from concluded. I positioned myself on my cot's edge, staring at the phone as if it might spontaneously combust. My thoughts raced, replaying Richard's conceited tone repeatedly. How could he consider this acceptable, selling something so personally meaningful to me as though it were a trinket he could exchange for his own advantage? The cabin wasn't merely mine. It represented a lifeline. It housed my childhood summers chasing lightning bugs and hiking with my mother before her remarriage. Following her death, it became my foundation, the single constant when everything else appeared unstable. Richard naturally felt no such connection. To him, it was simply another asset to manipulate, like numerous things he'd interfered with previously. But this wasn't some minor favor or inconvenience. This was my residence. I selected Laura's contact and waited for her response. "Hey Kathy, what's happening?" she said cheerfully upon answering. "Richard put the cabin on the market," I announced bluntly, unable to suppress the fury in my voice. A lengthy silence followed on her end. "He what?" "Apparently he required funds to cover gambling debts," I said with bitterness. "He believes he can act however he pleases, but I understand our co-ownership contract makes this impossible. He lacks the power to sell without your approval." Laura released a quiet whistle. "He actually believed he could succeed with this. That man possesses no dignity." "Absolutely none," I concurred. "I'll require your assistance resolving this matter. I'll complete my volunteer work and return home immediately. Can you locate the legal papers meanwhile? I want to be prepared to challenge this upon my return." "Absolutely," Laura responded, her voice resolute. "We'll handle this situation together." As I disconnected, an unusual calmness overcame me. Richard assumed he'd outwitted me, that my distance prevented any action regarding his treachery. But he didn't understand whom he was confronting. I was no longer the frightened teenager who previously allowed him to dominate me. I had become an adult with resources, supporters, and a solid understanding of legal matters. If he thought this was finished, he was approaching a harsh reality check. The following days blurred together as I completed my volunteer duties, attempting to maintain emotional control. Yet regardless of how occupied I remained, thoughts of Richard's betrayal persisted like an unwanted shadow. I couldn't eliminate the image of him celebrating the settlement of his debts at my cost. Late one evening, I opened my journal, something I consistently brought on trips. Writing assisted in organizing my thoughts, and I required clarity more than ever. As I wrote frantically, memories began surfacing. My first cabin visit with my mother, the hours spent renovating with Laura, the peaceful nights beside the fireplace when the world seemed motionless. This wasn't merely a structure. It was part of my identity, and Richard thought he could simply dispose of it like a gambling chip. Not this time. Laura contacted me again the following day, her tone sharp and professional. "I reviewed the co-ownership contract," she announced. "You were correct. He lacked authority to sell without my approval. The sale is void." Relief flowed through me, quickly replaced by anger. "Do we know the buyer?" "Not yet," Laura answered, "but I examined the county records and found no official ownership transfer. It appears he might have attempted this transaction unofficially." That sounded precisely like Richard, always seeking shortcuts, always trying to outsmart the system. "What's our next move?" I inquired. "We can either confront him directly," Laura suggested, "or allow the legal system to handle it. Regardless, we're protected. He has no legal foundation." I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Thanks, Laura. I'm unsure what I'd do without you." "You'd manage," she said warmly, "but I'll always support you." As I hung up, a strategy began forming. I'd finish my work here, return home, and confront Richard directly. I wouldn't shout or scream. That's what he anticipated. Instead, I'd take a different approach, using the one thing Richard consistently undervalued: my capacity to plan ahead. He thought he'd won, but by the time I finished, he'd realize he'd underestimated me for the final time. When I finally reached home, the first thing I observed was the silence. The cabin always greeted me with tranquility, but now that quiet felt threatening. My houseplants were slightly withered, mail had accumulated by the entrance, and the refrigerator was nearly empty. I set down my luggage and sighed, the weight of my necessary actions settling on my shoulders. Before I could even unpack, my phone rang. It was Richard. I considered letting it reach voicemail, but then reconsidered. Time to face him. Well, if it isn't my globe-trotting stepdaughter," he said, his voice dripping with artificial cheer. "Finally returned to reality, huh? What do you want, Richard?" I asked, getting straight to the point. "I just wanted to check in," he said smugly. "Make sure you're not too distressed about the whole cabin situation. I mean, it's gone now, so there's no point in lamenting over lost opportunities." He released a smug laugh that made my jaw clench. "Funny you should mention that," I replied, keeping my tone calm, "because as far as I can determine, it's not gone. Laura and I checked the ownership records. The sale didn't complete. You can't sell what doesn't belong to you." There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to indicate I'd hit a nerve. "That's absurd," Richard said, his voice tightening. "The buyer paid cash and the paperwork is complete. It's finished." "No, it's not," I said. "Laura and I co-own the cabin, remember? Without her consent, the sale is invalid. Legally, it remains ours." His laugh sounded brittle. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Always playing the perfect daughter, always trying to control everything. You don't understand how difficult I've had it, Catherine. I did what was necessary." "You stole from me," I responded sharply. "And you expect me to feel sympathy for you? You've made your decisions, Richard, and now you must face the consequences." The conversation ended with him disconnecting, and I stood there, phone in hand, trembling with a mixture of anger and triumph. For years, I'd allowed Richard to manipulate situations, guilt-trip me, and exploit my patience. But not anymore. I wasn't just defending the cabin. I was reclaiming my boundaries, my voice, and my peace of mind. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, my laptop open, reviewing the documents Laura had sent me. The co-ownership agreement was absolutely clear. Neither of us could sell the cabin without the other's written consent. Richard's actions weren't just unethical, they were blatantly illegal. My thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. When I opened it, there he was, Richard, wearing his usual smug expression. "Mind if I enter?" he asked, though he didn't wait for permission before stepping inside. I crossed my arms, watching as he made himself comfortable in one of my chairs. "What do you want, Richard?" "Look, Catherine," he started, his tone dripping with condescension. "I understand you're upset, but you need to understand my position." I was desperate. The people I owed money to weren't exactly patient. I raised an eyebrow. "And you thought stealing my property was the solution?" "Borrowing," he corrected as though that made it better. "I was going to make it back once my luck improved. I would have repaid you every penny." I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "Your luck. That's what you're relying on, Richard. You've been gambling away money for as long as I've known you, and it's never worked out. Why would this time be any different?" He shifted uncomfortably, but his bravado quickly returned. "You're overreacting. It's just a cabin. You're not even here most of the time. Why not let someone else make use of it?" "Because it's mine," I snapped. "Because it's my home. You don't get to decide what I value or what I do with my property. And for the record, Laura values it just as much as I do. Your little sale is invalid, and you know it." His face darkened, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something like fear. "You wouldn't really go to the authorities, would you? You wouldn't ruin your own stepfather like that." I leaned forward, meeting his gaze. "Try me." For the first time, Richard didn't have a snappy retort. He stood up, muttering something under his breath, and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I sank back into my chair, my heart pounding. The confrontation had left me shaken, but I also felt a spark of satisfaction. Richard was beginning to realize that his usual tactics wouldn't work on me anymore. This wasn't just about the cabin. It was about standing up to someone who had taken advantage of me for far too long. After Richard's dramatic departure, I called Laura to update her. "He appeared at my house," I said, pacing the living room. "Tried to spin some sob story about how he borrowed the cabin to settle his debts." Laura snorted on the other end of the line. "Borrowed? Does he even hear himself? What did you say?" "I told him the sale was invalid, and if he pushed me, I'd go to the authorities," I replied. That seemed to shake him a little, but knowing Richard, he's probably already scheming his next move. "Well, let him scheme," Laura said firmly. "We've got the law on our side. I've contacted a lawyer to help us draft a formal cease and desist letter. If he tries to involve the buyer again, we'll have a legal paper trail ready to shut it down." I nodded, her words grounding me. "Thanks, Laura. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'd figure it out," she said. "But we're in this together." Over the next few days, I focused on gathering all the evidence I could. I documented the co-ownership agreement, collected screenshots of text messages Richard had sent about the sale, and even tracked down the real estate agent who had been involved. When I contacted the agent, her voice was tense. "Look, I didn't know the full situation," she said quickly. "Richard told me he had permission to sell. If I'd known the cabin had a co-owner, I never would have touched the deal." "Well, now you do," I said, keeping my tone even. "I'm not trying to drag you into this, but I need your cooperation. Can you confirm that Richard signed the paperwork alone?" "Yes," she admitted. "The buyer hasn't paid in full yet because I flagged the transaction as unusual. I can provide you with the documents if you need them." "That would be helpful," I said, jotting down her information. As I hung up, I felt a renewed sense of determination. Richard had banked on me being too passive or too distant to fight back, but he was about to learn just how wrong he'd been. That evening, Laura called with more good news. "The letter's ready," she said. "We'll send it first thing tomorrow, and if he tries to pull anything else, we'll escalate." "Perfect," I replied, a small smile creeping onto my face. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was gaining control of the situation. Richard thought he could steamroll me, but he was about to find out that I wasn't so easily defeated. The next morning, Laura and I finalized the cease and desist letter and sent it to Richard. The language was clear and unyielding. Any further attempts to claim ownership of the cabin or engage the buyer would result in legal action. I imagined his reaction when he received it, probably a mix of outrage and disbelief. For years, he'd gotten away with manipulating and intimidating people into submission, but this time he was up against a wall he couldn't charm his way through. Later that day, the real estate agent emailed me the documentation she'd promised. Seeing Richard's signature on the fraudulent sale agreement made my stomach turn, but it also solidified my resolve. He hadn't just crossed a line, he'd bulldozed over it. That evening, I got a call from Detective Miller, a local officer Laura had contacted to help with the case. "Miss Daniel," he began, his tone professional, "I've reviewed the documents you and Miss Langley provided. It's clear that the sale was unauthorized. Based on the evidence, we can move forward with a formal investigation if you'd like." "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I want to pursue this." Detective Miller continued. "We'll start by contacting the buyer and explaining the situation. If Richard continues to interfere, we'll escalate to criminal charges for fraudulent misrepresentation." "Thank you, Detective," I said. "Please let me know if you need anything else from me." As I hung up, I felt a mix of relief and anticipation. The wheels were in motion now, and there was no turning back. The next day, Richard called. His voice laced with anger but with an edge of desperation beneath it. "Do you have any idea what you've done, Catherine?" he demanded. "You're ruining everything." "No, Richard," I replied calmly. "I'm protecting what's mine. You did this to yourself. You've always been so ungrateful," he sneered. "I stepped in when your mom couldn't handle things, and this is how you repay me?" I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "You didn't step in, Richard. You took over. You manipulated, lied, and used people to get what you wanted. And now you're paying the price." He started to argue, but I cut him off. "This conversation is over. If you have anything else to say, take it up with my lawyer." I hung up and leaned back in my chair, my heart racing. Richard's days of pushing me around were over, and I was finally in control. 2 days later, Detective Miller called me with an update. "Miss Daniels," he said, "we've spoken with the buyer and they've agreed to halt the transaction. They were unaware of the co-ownership agreement and are willing to cooperate with any further investigation." Relief flooded through me. "That's great news. Does this mean the sale is officially voided?" "Yes," he confirmed. "The cabin remains under your and Ms. Langley's ownership. However, we'll need to keep the case open to address your stepfather's fraudulent actions. Do you wish to press charges?" I hesitated for only a moment. "Yes," I said firmly. "I want him held accountable." "Understood," Detective Miller said. "We'll proceed accordingly. Thank you for your cooperation." After the call, I let out a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm returning. The cabin was safe, and Richard's schemes were unraveling. Later that afternoon, I called Laura to share the news. "The sale is officially void," I told her. "The buyer's backing out, and the cabin is ours again." "That's a huge win," Laura said, her excitement evident. "But what about Richard?" "The police are moving forward with their investigation," I explained. "He's not getting away with this." "Good," she said. "It's about time someone stood up to him." Her words stuck with me long after we hung up. For years, I'd let Richard get away with so much. His manipulations, his entitlement, his complete disregard for boundaries. But this time I'd fought back, and it felt like a turning point, not just for this situation but for how I approached everything in my life. That evening, I went to the cabin for the first time since coming home. Stepping inside, I felt an overwhelming wave of emotion. The smell of the wood panels, the familiar creak of the floorboards, it all reminded me of why this place meant so much to me. I sat by the fireplace, letting the quiet of the mountains wash over me. This was my haven, the place where I built memories, celebrated milestones, and found peace in the chaos of life. And it was still mine, no thanks to Richard. For the first time I let myself smile. I wasn't just reclaiming a property. I was reclaiming a part of myself. A week later, Detective Miller called with the final update. "Miss Daniels," he said, "I wanted to let you know that your stepfather has been formally charged with fraudulent misrepresentation and attempted theft of property. He'll be required to appear in court, and based on the evidence we've gathered, the case against him is strong." Hearing those words brought a mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and even a touch of sadness. "Thank you for everything, Detective," I said sincerely. "You handled this situation with a lot of strength," he replied. "It's not easy to stand up to family, but you did the right thing." After the call, I sat quietly for a while, processing the weight of everything that had happened. Richard had been such a constant force in my life for years, albeit a toxic one, and now I was finally free from his manipulations. The next day, Laura and I met at the cabin. She'd brought a bottle of wine to celebrate, and we sat on the porch overlooking the mountains, the crisp air carrying the scent of pine and earth. "To us," she said, raising her glass, "and to not letting anyone push us around." I clinked my glass against hers, laughing softly. "To us." As we talked, I realized how much I'd learned from this ordeal. I'd spent so much of my life avoiding conflict, trying to keep the peace, especially with Richard. But this time I'd stood my ground, and it felt like a turning point, not just for my relationship with him but for how I saw myself. "You know," Laura said, interrupting my thoughts, "this cabin has always been more than just a property. It's a symbol of everything we've built, everything we've worked for. Don't ever let anyone take that from you again." Her words hit home. The cabin wasn't just a house in the mountains. It was a reflection of my independence, my resilience, and my determination to protect what mattered most to me. Later that night, as I sat by the fireplace, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Richard's betrayal had tested me in ways I never expected, but it had also shown me how strong I could be. The cabin was safe, my boundaries were firmly in place, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly in control of my life. In the weeks that followed, life slowly settled into a new rhythm. The cabin, once a battleground for Richard's greed, became my refuge again. Each creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the trees outside, reminded me of what I'd fought to protect. I didn't hear much from Richard after the charges were filed. My mom called once, her voice hesitant. "You know how he gets, Catherine," she said, her usual defense of him ringing hollow this time. "I do," I replied evenly, "and that's why I did what I had to do." She didn't argue. For the first time, there was no attempt to guilt me, no desperate plea for reconciliation, just a quiet sigh before she said, "I hope you find peace." "I already have," I said, and I meant it. Laura and I spent the next few weekends working on small renovations to the cabin. We painted the porch, patched up the roof, and planted a few wildflowers along the edge of the property. With every nail hammered and brushstroke applied, it felt like I was reclaiming more than just the space. I was reclaiming myself. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Laura turned to me. "So what's next for you, Kathy? You've taken back the cabin, stood up to Richard. What's the next big move?" I thought about her question for a moment, the answer coming to me with surprising clarity. "I'm going to keep doing what I love," I said. "Volunteering, traveling, living my life on my terms. But this time, I'm not letting anyone else dictate how I live it." She smiled, raising her glass. "To that." As the days passed, I found myself reflecting more on everything I'd learned from this ordeal. It wasn't just about the cabin or even Richard. It was about realizing my own strength. For years, I'd let his behavior dictate how much I pushed back, how much I tolerated. But now I knew I was capable of setting boundaries and holding them, no matter how uncomfortable it made others. The cabin stood as a symbol of that growth, a reminder that I didn't have to sacrifice my peace or my values for anyone else's comfort. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, I stood on the porch, breathing in the cool pine-scented air. For the first time in years I felt truly at home, not just in the cabin but in my own life.